There, let's do that. Okay, guys, I'm happy to welcome Shawn Thomas. He is the president of Integrity. I just want to make sure, right? Integrity Appraisal. And he owns a company that Gibraltar uses for their appraisals. Okay. And we invited Shawn, and he's been here before, because if you could ask anybody what the problem is in today's market, it's appraisals. And everyone is very, very frustrated with it. So we thought we would go to the man, and we'll be nice to Shawn. We won't blame you too much, but we wanted him, I gave him some questions that I thought you'd want to know. Particularly the first one is what's going on with everything having multiple offers, which is market value, and then not appraising, which is supposed to be market value. So I know he's going to talk about that. So if you have a question, you can put it in chat. After he finishes, those of you that are here can ask questions. And so we're going to go ahead and begin with Shawn. Welcome, Shawn.
Thank you for having me. Sorry I can't be there in person, but nonetheless, I'm glad to be with you guys today. So Sharon sent me a few questions to start with. Like she said, after we get done with these, I'll open it up. Those of you who have heard from me before, I'm much more inclined to hear what you guys have to ask rather than me stand up and bore you with appraisal talk. So I guess we can address the elephant in the room, right? Which is the crazy market that we're in, what we're seeing in the appraisal world, not just in Houston, but we're in 20 other states. And it's, I assure you, it's not as bad here as it is in other places. Nonetheless, let's just skip over to Sharon's questions so we can get these going, right? So first question, we have multiple offers and settle on a price, which by definition is fair market value, but the appraisals keep coming in low. Apparently that's a big issue, not just in Houston, but all over. And I think it's important to point out, number one, just go through the definitions of certain things, right? So that we can make sure that we're all on the same page and we're understanding and thinking about this the correct way. So list price is effectively, for simple terms, it is what the seller hopes to get for the house, right? What you guys go in and discuss, pull comps, and not necessarily, we're seeing a lot of homes being listed way higher than what comps might suggest. So it's more of a supply and demand issue than it is a supported number in this particular market, right? Which I totally understand. As a listing agent, you're trying to get the most for your buyers. So that's the simplest definition, for the lack of, just for the sake of time, that I can give for list price, right? Market value, in my opinion, in my 17-year career in this business, is almost about the same as the sale price, right? It's what the buyer and seller agree, the terms that they agree on, but that's also a consumer-driven number, right? You have a seller who lists the property, you have a buyer who's willing to come in and pay that number, and it's an agreement that's consumer-driven. Am I back up? Okay. And then we have appraised value, right? Appraised value is the opinion of the licensed or certified appraiser as of that effective date, right, on what the home is worth based on certain criteria, right? And those criteria are defined by the lending institutions that give out loans so that your buyers, unless they're paying cash, right, can get a loan to buy the house. And so the differences between all those is what I think our two professions are missing. Realtors, understandably, fair market value is what is someone willing to pay and they're willing to sell it for. Let's do it. Here we go. But it is the appraiser's job to figure out the worth of that home as of the effective date of that appraisal. So that day, right, based on historical data. And I think that's where our industry is missing the button a little bit, is, and there are talks about this, and sharing your second question that I'm going to get to kind of hits on this as well. But there's a lot of people rethinking right now kind of how we do what we do from an appraisal perspective in regards to rapidly increasing markets like we're in right now. Obviously, list prices and even market value to a degree are forward-looking numbers, right? Appraisals are historical, backward-looking numbers. We can only base a value on past closed sales, period. So even with all these pendings and listings that are maybe above, it is against USPAP and the lending guys for an appraiser to reconcile a value, right? To put a value on a home based on pendings and listings. So everything we do is based on what has settled, so closed, right? So historical data. And I think that's where kind of the question has come up here recently over the past year or so is how can we tweak the appraisal industry and the rules and regulations that we are bound by to allow for us to get a little bit more aggressive in markets like we are in today to help support the increasing market. Because as of right now, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's still increasing, but the appraisal perspective or the appraisal issue from a value perspective is not allowing some people to buy houses, right? Because the values can't get there. They don't have the difference cash to put down and all that kind of stuff. So it is an ongoing issue. The powers that be in our industry, along with the National Association of Realtors, the Home Builders Association, I've been on calls with them, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and HUD, to discuss, ways in which the appraisal industry might be able to kind of keep up with something like this. As of right now, there is only one tool that appraisers have in order to combat a rapidly rising market like we're in today, right? Which I want to make sure that everyone understands what we're seeing right now is not appreciation. This is not a yearly appreciation, a normal appreciation, right? This is a total supply and demand, consumer-driven market. There's a ton of buyers out there, no inventory, not a lot of sellers, as Sharon alluded to with your listings, right? It's hard to get listings right now. And people that are willing to sell at the top of the market, if they're going to buy, they're buying at the top of the market, right? So it's just the lack of inventory is a big issue, which is what's driving up these home prices, right? So it's not really a year-over-year appreciation we're seeing. It is a supply and demand spike, right? And the only tool that appraisers have to try to keep up with this are time adjustments. That's it. Because we're basing everything off historical data. So what time adjustments are is the appraisers can go back and let's say that we have comparable sales that closed in maybe December of last year, January of this year. If we can prove, which is very easy to in this market, right? A trending analysis, right? Marketing times under 90 days, home prices rising, listings are down, all that kind of stuff. And we can attach a monthly increase in the local market. Now, remember, we don't deal in macro markets, right? We're not talking as Houston as a whole or Texas as a whole or what have you, right? We are talking about our market where the subject property is, whatever the appraiser determines that to be. If we can prove that it's rising, we can assign a monthly adjustment for that. So if a home that's sold in December, let's say it's rising 1% a month just for round numbers, we can assign a 1% adjustment, positive adjustment to that sale price, to that from the contract date to our appraisal date, right? That's a very big point that I want you guys to understand. It's not from when it closed. It's from when it went under contract, when the sale was agreed to, right? So we can assign a time adjustment from the contract date of the comp to the effective date of the appraisal today, if it were being done today. And that is the only tool that appraisers have, that we're allowed to use, rather, to try to keep up with the market like we're in today. So I guess the point of that is that the industry is trying to determine ways in which they will allow us to do certain things to help the situation like we're in. We have time adjustments that we can make, right? They've been around for a long time, but they've only recently come back, prior to 08 and 09. Obviously, we all know what went down there, but it is something that's being looked at, right? Now, hitting on question 2, which kind of falls into the same category, Sharon asked, in a rising market, why can't the appraiser give more credence to the cost or income approach, right? Obviously, materials are going up, labor's going up, the price of lumber goes up 20% every 2 weeks. I have meetings with builders from all over the country all the time to hear about this. And we do several thousand new construction deals a month in several states, right? And it's all the same issue. lumber's going up, materials are going up, right? So the builders are raising prices to keep their margin, right? So they're not eating it. And again, there is not a lender in the country that will make a loan based on the cost approach value, right? The cost approach is simply there to support the sales comparison approach. So the call that I was on with Fannie, Freddie, HUD, the National Association of Realtors, and the National Home Builders Association was specifically had to address allowing appraisers to put more weight on the cost approach when we are determining a reconciled value. Now, they're talking about it now, right? That means if they agree to do it, it might happen in 10 years. It's the government, right? Once they decide to do something, it takes a long time for it to be implemented. So, but until Fannie, Freddie, and HUD, the agencies that develop the guidelines for lending and appraisals, make that change, there's not a whole lot an appraiser can do about it. We can go out and appraise a house and put whatever number we want on it, right? That is the opinion of the appraiser. If the lender will not make a loan to your buyer, it is a useless appraisal, right? It's worthless. So the trick is getting aggressive, using the one tool that we have, right, which is going to be the time adjustments, pulling good comparables and getting aggressive within our value range, and still trying to adhere to the lending guidelines so that we make sure that it passes underwriting and the loan is given. So that's kind of, you know, the game that we're playing right now. And, you know, I always like to give a plug to Gibraltar when I can. And this is a very big one, right? Especially in today's lending environment. You know, they play in the big box, right? They only make us adhere to the agency guidelines. A lot of other companies that sell to investors like Wells, Chase, BB&T, SunTrust, or what have you, all those investors have overlays on Fannie and Freddie and HUD. So that makes our box to fit the appraisal through smaller, right? So Gibraltar sells direct, which means we get to push the appraisal through the biggest box, which is a good thing. It has the least amount of restrictions on what we can do. So that allows us to get a little bit more aggressive and a little bit more creative when we're doing these things to try to keep up with this rapidly increasing market. Sharon, did I address kind of what's going on? Maybe not what you wanted to hear, but I always want to tell the truth, right? I mean, it's
maybe if some people are newer, would you explain what an overlay is?
Yes, ma'am. So an overlay, sure. So the agencies that determine not only lending guidelines, but appraisal guidelines, what they will accept and what we are allowed to do, right, within the confines of their rules. So Fannie, Freddie, and Ginnie, which is HUD and VA, they have just basic guidelines for appraisals and loans that they have to adhere to, right? Other investors have rules on top of their rules. So it effectively is making a rule on top of a rule, making it harder to get it through. So those are overlays. Overlays are more rules on top of the basic rules. And so therefore it's making it harder for us to adhere to those rules, right? Because they're more stringent, they're more restrictive and things of that nature.
So if we get a low one, what are the odds that the appraisal will review it and make it higher? And what are the odds? And then if they ever would change it, then why would they change it? Meaning that you have a low appraisal and everybody freaks out, and then the listing agent says, wait, you know, I don't think the comps they used are right. What about this? What about that? And tries to get the lender the appraiser to make a different value. Does that happen? Or if it does happen, why would it happen?
So it does happen. I would, you know, each company is different, right? We at my company has a dispute resolution process. If we have a low appraisal, number one, we have a deal with Gibraltar, with Gary Green specifically, that says that we are going to reach out to the listing agents to get their data, period. I want to see what the agents have to offer, right? That is a big deal. You guys are professionals in your local markets. I want to see the data, or the appraiser wants to see the data to make sure we're not missing something, to make sure we're on the same page, all that kind of stuff. If a deal comes in low, number one, we alert Gibraltar first. We don't just send out a low appraisal, right? And the reason that is because these days, the appraisal doesn't just go. It is uploaded into a portal.
Shawn,
right? So all of the governing bodies, when we upload that appraisal,
you cut out. So can you just go back about a sentence?
Yes, ma'am. So when we get an appraisal completed, it gets uploaded, right, to a portal, and all of the agencies see it. So all of the governing bodies see what the appraiser just did. So in order to get the appraiser to change a value after it's been uploaded to a portal, we have to make sure that we're submitting good, viable, pertinent data for them to consider, right? I would say that we've got about a 60% success rate at my shop if we have good, pertinent data to provide to the appraiser. I can't speak for other companies' dispute resolution processes. I can tell you that some other companies' dispute resolution process is to just not answer, right? That's what happened to me when I tried to do my loan with Wells Fargo. It came in low and they never called me back. So I switched banks, right? So different companies have different dispute resolution processes, but our process is we reach out to the agents. When everybody's agreed that we've looked at all the data, we send out the low appraisal for review with a dispute form. If there's additional data, it can be submitted to us. And then if we agree that it's pertinent and should be looked at, we go to the appraiser, right? So we kind of fight that battle with you guys if I agree that it should be looked at again. So that's how we handle it internally.
Okay, so, oh, yes, that was one of them. We still hear buyers and sometimes agents putting a lot of emphasis on price per square foot. They'll take a comparable that's X hundred price per square foot, that's 2,000 square feet. They think their house should be at 2,400, $100 times that. And so could you speak to price per square foot as far as an appraiser is concerned?
Yes, ma'am. So appraisers typically don't use price per square foot for much at all, right? And the reason being is the price per square foot methodology is flawed in a way that there are not adjustments being made for the differences between the properties, right? So price per square foot essentially lumps everything about the property, the lot size, if it's updated or not, whether it has a pool or not, the location, everything, it lumps it into one number. So unless you have identical sales that are completely identical in every way, right, you're not accounting for the differences between the homes. Whereas on an appraisal, we choose the most physically similar homes, right, sales, and then adjustments are made for the differences in regards to lot size, upgrades, 1 story versus 2, if that's the case, date of sale, right, the time adjustments that we talked about, all of that stuff, adjustments are made to account for those differences. And then we reconcile based on the adjusted values within the range of adjusted values at the bottom, right? The price per square foot issue, like I said, it lumps everything into one number, and it's also an easily manipulated number. So a lot of times when we have low value situations, right, I'll get involved. We'll send a dispute form to the listing agent. And let's just say, for instance, as an example, it's a 3,000 square foot house. We will get back a CMA with homes from literally 1,200 square feet to 3,100 square feet. That's obviously being manipulated by the smaller homes, right? The price per square foot number, right? Smaller homes sell for more on a price per square foot basis. It's economies of scale. And so we'll get comps, from 1,500 to 3,100, and then the price per square foot number will be circled at the bottom. And they're going, well, if we apply this to our house, we would make it. Well, if I could go into River Oaks and pull comps and make any value that I wanted to make. Now, will it go through underwriting? No. Will you lose your license? Probably yes. So the price per square foot thing is also very easy to manipulate. It's more important that we make sure that we are pulling comparables similarly so that we're all looking at the same data, right? More often than not, when we have a low value, I'll look at the appraiser's report. I can recreate their search criteria from looking at the report and reading the report. I'll run my own data, run the appraiser's data, and then I will get the listing agent's data. Oftentimes, or more often than not, rather, My data and the appraiser's data are pretty similar. They match up pretty well. But the listing agent data that we get, it's not, right? If we're not looking at the same data, we are not going to be close to each other when it comes to ascertaining a value. So I think it's most important to make sure that we're using good search criteria and we all are looking at these same comparables so that we're at least in the same window and we're looking at the same stuff.
Okay, so you talked about the agent's role in the appraisal. And so we still sometimes hear co-ops and people saying, oh, I thought it was against the law for the agents to talk to the appraiser. That's number one. And number two, we know that's not true. So what is it that you would want a listing agent to do to help the appraiser? Should they give comp? Should they give the fact it's multiple offers? Should they give the upgrades? What should we do to help the appraiser?
Yes, ma'am. All of the above, right? I know it's weird COVID time, right? We've been dealing with this for a year now. And some people may not feel comfortable meeting the appraiser on site, but I always used to encourage people to meet the appraiser on site. They're people, right? And then you have the opportunity to actually give them your information. But I think it's important for the agent to, at a minimum, when the appraiser calls to schedule the appointment, get the email address, send them your CMA, send them the updates and options or upgrades that have been in the home since they bought it, right? If an appraiser walks into a house and sees granite countertops, we see granite, right? It's very hard for us to tell that it's level 3 versus level 7. But if that's something that you're pricing into your home, it's something that would be helpful for the appraiser to know and be made aware of, right? So any updates, options, your CMA, and then maybe even some things like if there's a comp down the street that, and maybe not a good example here, but we had one last week where there was a sale of the same floor plan down the street and it sold 15% below market value, below what we feel was market value. Well, we have to be able to explain why we're not using that comp, right? So not only do we have to explain why we're using what we're using, these days we have to explain why we didn't use certain other comps that are out there. And the agent was very instrumental. We called and she said, well, I knew that lady. It was a very bitter divorce and they just dumped the property. So that allowed us good reasoning to avoid using that comp, which would have had a negative impact on the overall value, right? So even things like that are very helpful. So any information that you guys have that you feel might be pertinent and helpful would be helpful to give to the appraiser. The more
what about
data,
if there was multiple offers? What about if there was multiple offers?
Absolutely. Multiple offers. Obviously, it's a very common thing these days. I don't think it's necessary to send contracts or anything like that, but just share with the appraiser, we had 15 offers in the first 2 days. What that does, we can't make a multiple offer adjustment on an appraisal, right? And I'm sure Mike, when he talks to you guys next week, he's very good. He's been doing this longer than I have. He's very knowledgeable, but he'll attest to that too, right? There is no multiple offer adjustment that can be made. However, situations like that can allow us to get more aggressive within our range of value, right? So appraisals are always a range. After the adjustments are made, there is a low and a high, right? And the reconciled value has to be somewhere in this range. If we get outside of it on the high side or the low side, we get in the same amount of trouble either way, right? So an appraiser can get in the same trouble for lowballing as they can for pushing a value over what it should be, right? And so appraisals are always a range of value. The multiple offer situation and the pendings and the listings and all that stuff allow us to get very aggressive within the range, but we cannot exceed the range. Otherwise, lending will not approve it because it's not supported. So that's what the multiple offers, telling an appraiser we have multiple offers, all this kind of stuff, it helps them get more aggressive, but there's no adjustment that can be made for that.
I know there's a lot of variables using comparables because, as you said, sometimes agents will send things to you that aren't comparables and you can't use them. So I know there's a lot of them, but what would be the biggest things you would look at? How far can you go back? You had mentioned square footage has to be the same. What about bedrooms, pools? Can you make sort of a statement about what you would be looking for as a comparable?
Sure. So number one, as far as proximity, I can give you agency guidelines, right? So in urban areas, it's 1 mile. So they would prefer to us to stay within 1 mile of the subject property. In suburban areas, it's 3 miles. And in rural areas, it's 7. Now, keep in mind, those are guidelines, right? If we exceed them for whatever reason, it's okay as long as we have good reason. However, what you need to be careful of, because I see this a lot too. So let's just say that, we've got a deal in a townhome in town, right? Inner loop. We will see agents draw a 1 mile circle and they skip over the ones that are right next door that are almost identical. And they're going over here and over here and over here and over here and over here. And they go, here we go, boom, right? Well, remember what I said before, appraisers have to explain why we're skipping over. So if you're going a mile away and there have been 4 or 5 comps sold in between that one and your subject, we have to be able to explain why we skipped over each one of those other ones. Why were they not as good as the one that you're skipping over to go get, right? So we don't get to draw a circle and then cherry pick the ones that make our deal work. That's unfortunately not how it works. So while the proximity guidelines are agency guidelines, we are always trying to pick the most physically similar, most proximate comps possible. So in a resale scenario, if you can pull all your comps from your same section, that is the best, right? Probably the same builder, same materials, all that good stuff. Not to mention that location is the absolute hardest adjustment for an appraiser to make. There are so many variables. When you start getting out into competing areas, especially different school districts, golf course community versus not, the amenities, right, are different, all that kind of stuff. There's so many variables. It's very hard for appraisers to ascertain adjustments. I mean, sometimes that's what we have to do. But if at all possible, we want to stay within our same market, our location. So location obviously is the #1 value contributing factor in real estate, right? If we took a house out of the Champions and we put it in the middle of town, price goes up because where it's located. So location is always going to be #1. It is very important when you guys are pulling comps that you establish your location. I do that when I'm doing this, when I'm reviewing reports. I use the mapping function and I pin my subject property. It's the first thing I do every single time, right? Then I take the polygon tool because circles and squares will cross all kinds of neighborhood boundaries, right? I take the polygon tool and I draw my market boundaries. Now I know where I'm pulling my comps from, right? That is step #1 that I think we all need to kind of get together on to start with when you're searching. Now, market boundaries can consist of a lot of things, right? This is where your local knowledge comes into play. It can be, elementary schools, right? When you get into town, there are certain streets. I mean, you can see the street. A house is $100 grand more over here than it is over here because they're zoned to this elementary. And that is the only reason, right? Where I live in Katy Fulshire area, 1093, the same builder builds the same house on either side of 1093. This one sells for 50 grand more because it is in Katy ISD. This is Lamar ISD, right? That is a market boundary. So you guys, draw your market boundaries, and now we've established where we're pulling our comps from, which is absolutely step #1. The next one is going to be square footage, right? The next value contributing factor that carries the most weight in a standard scenario is going to be how big is my house, right? How big is the house? And so I typically start my search with plus or minus 20%. It's a fairly big number, but I'm also looking for a good group of sales that I can whittle down to the most comparable, right? And that 20% number is also is an agency guideline. So if we exceed 20% square footage up or down, we have to be able to explain why we did that, right? But those two are the biggest criteria, I think, where appraisers and agents are missing each other. #1, starting with location, and then #2 with square footage. And then let's see, site size, right? Lot size is plus or minus 15%, agency guideline. There's no guideline in regards to age, right? I mean, I go plus or minus 10 years in my initial search, just because my initial search, if I make it so tight that it doesn't yield me at least 3 sales, I have to start over, right? I have to have a minimum of 3 sales in a report. So you don't want to make your initial search criteria so tight that you don't get any data, right? We want to see data. We can always crunch it down. We are allowed to go back a year if we have to, right? Obviously, in today's market, we want to try to stay as close as we can. Inside 30 days would be phenomenal. But we are allowed to go back a year. If we're going back a year, I would expect to see some kind of time adjustment, on that comp, because we are not in the same market we were a year ago. We're not in the same market we were 6 months ago. But go back a year in time. I mean, that's really the only search criteria I use to start my initial search. I don't get into pools. I don't get into 1-story versus 2. I don't get into bed and bath count yet, right? Because I want to see that whole market play out in front of me so that I can start picking the best, most proximate, physically similar sales to my subject property. And that's when we start getting into, are we updated versus not updated? Do we have a pool? They don't have a pool, all that kind of stuff. I know it's a lot I threw at you right there. So
you've been alluding to they won't let us and we can get into trouble, and maybe, and all of us, like when the appraiser comes in and it's low, we're like, what, that guy's must be an idiot, right? Or why is this person doing this to me? So can you maybe speak a little bit to what would happen to an appraiser if they just, you begged them and they did something, or what rules they're guided by?
Sure. So appraisers are guided by several rules, right? Number one being the Uniform Appraisal Practice Standards, which is USPAP, right? That governs appraising from, if we're appraising the ring on Sharon's finger or the Empire State Building, right? Is the basic appraisal rules when determining how you can go about doing what you're doing. So that is number one. Number two are agency guidelines, right? The guidelines set on appraisers by Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Ginnie Mae, HUD, VA, right? All of the ones that make up the lending policies. And then we've got the federal statutes, right? Dodd-Frank, Regulation Z, that have appraisal guidelines and appraisal criteria as well. And so in the states have to abide by those as well, right? So, if an appraiser were to get in trouble, at first they're investigated by the state, right? If you're investigated by the state and something goes wrong, we've had this happen to a few people in the past that have worked with me. You're looking at several $1,000 fines and suspension of your license for 6 months to a year, even to the point where they've taken licenses away. If they figure out that there's some kind of fraudulent activity, you are absolutely losing your license and you're going to jail. I know 2 appraisers just out of Houston, word of mouth, that spent 3 and 5 years in jail over something that they did. Now it was a straw buyer scheme and fraud was involved, but that's a reality. Jail time is a reality if you do something stupid, right? So, but I don't think there's any appraisers out there that are going to take that chance, to be honest with you. We're all trying to be as aggressive as we can within the guidelines that we have to work through and buy.
There's really no upside for an appraiser to try to fix the numbers just because they feel sorry for the poor family that wants to get in it. There's no upside for them, but there's a downside.
No, it's all downside. And obviously, I mean, we can be aggressive as we possibly can. And I can assure you guys, sincerely, there is not an appraiser in the world that wants to cut a value, right? When we make value, we send the appraisal out, the loan gets closed, hopefully. The people move into their house, you guys get paid, and it's margarita time, right? We move on to the next deal. When we cut a value, it is a week and a half of back and forth, right? All of our time. We don't get to move on to the next deal, right? All that kind of stuff. So to cut a value it's not an easy thing. We don't take it lightly, and it's not something we want to do. It makes life miserable for everybody. And that is not what we're looking to do, because I don't know how other companies work. I've heard horror stories, but when we have a low value, and Chris and Jackie can and you guys have worked with me long enough, you know this, right? We dig in. And if we can figure it out, we're figuring it out. It's not like, I'm sorry, your value is low, go away, go to the next deal. We don't do that, right? If we think there's room there, we're trying to scratch out every $1,000 we can, or we're fighting tooth and nail. If we think there's a valid point, we're fighting with the appraiser. And so it takes up time. Time is money, right? I'm not moving on. I'm still stuck on that. The appraiser is still stuck on that. You guys are still stuck on that. And it's a back and forth. So we do not the appraisers do not want to cut deals. They don't want to, but they do have a responsibility to protect your borrowers and your buyers and the banks. That is why they're there. An appraisal is a protective measure so that we don't end up in an 08, 09 scenario again, right? And there are guidelines and rules that we have to follow, or you end up losing your license and getting fined, or if you're an idiot, you do something fraudulent, you go to jail. And so, you know, we're held accountable, right? The appraisers are held accountable for the values that they turn in and submit.
Okay, so there are appraisers and there's appraisers and appraisers, just like there's realtors and realtors and realtors. So how would you know? I know that Gibraltar uses your company, yes, right? Mainly, but then how do other brokerages work? Is there a pool of names they pull from, or do they just randomly pick somebody, or how does that work? Because how can sometimes we get an appraiser that we think that this person just didn't know what they were doing, and then sometimes, of course, they do. How are they picked?
So it depends on the company that they're dealing with. The lender is choosing to do business with, right? Gibraltar chooses to do business with my company. So the way that we work is we have an approved panel of appraisers that cover 20 states, right? But we single them down to coverage areas. I have people in my office out here that physically choose an appraiser's name for every deal that we get. So it's not a rotating, automated, random selection process, right? There are a lot of companies out there that do a random automated wheel, just like VA does, right? On a VA deal, if Bob lives in Galveston, but the deal is in Champions and it's VA and it's Bob's turn, Bob's getting the appraisal and Bob is driving from Galveston to Champions to do the deal. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Like, that's how it works. And there are a lot of AMCs that do that as well. We choose not to do that. I think it's just a terrible way to do business, right? We're taking appraisers out of their geographic competency and putting them in areas they may not know. And that just goes bad for everybody, right? So we are very careful in the fact that we keep our people in their local markets. Number one, it helps for speed. And number two, it helps because we have appraisers that know the area. And they know that this elementary, people pay more to be in this elementary or this school district. Whereas if you're coming from out of town, he may not know that. And if you don't point it out to them as a realtor, they're not going to know that. And they're pulling comps from the wrong area to use for your area and dragging values down or whatever the case may be. So the way that we operate is we handpick appraisers physically from within our system who are approved. We don't just approve appraisers randomly. They have to go through an approval process. We review their reports, all that kind of stuff, look at their disciplinary action history if they have any. So it's a little bit of a process, but what that does is that makes sure that we do have the best of the best on our panel. So that's what we do as a company.
Okay, I think we got time for a few more questions. There's one in the chat, I think, that Jeff asked. How do you determine what incremental price per square foot adjustment to use when comparing the subject to the comp?
Good question, Jeff. So obviously each appraiser, right, adjustments are all going to be subjective to the appraiser and the market data that they run and whatever contributory value percentage they choose to use. What I mean by contributory value is, you know, cost and value are not the same, right? So we use the term contributory value to say, what does that extra 300 square foot on that larger home contribute to the overall value of the home, right? Unfortunately, it's not a price per square foot scenario, right? So if homes are selling at $200 a square foot, the appraiser is not going to adjust for $200 a foot. And it's going to be up to that individual appraiser and the adjustments that they run, the data they run, whether it be through the regression analysis or paired data analysis or what have you. But I can tell you that in order for you not to get hurt, right, if you're trying to determine this scenario, if you want to use somewhere between 50 to 60% of the price per square foot average, you know, of good comparable sales. So just for round numbers, if your houses are selling around $100 a foot and you've got a house that's 200 square foot larger than yours and you're adjusting down, you can adjust that at maybe 50 to 60 bucks a foot down per square foot and be in the ballpark of where the appraiser is.
Does anybody have a question? Yes, Ryan. Brian, I'm either going to have to come up here or I'm going to have to repeat it because the people on the Zoom won't be able to hear you. And this man how many houses did you sell last year? 82. So he's in the mix here, Brian.
Okay. So if you have, say you have 2 houses pending in the same neighborhood, and one of them you've sold for cash, or they are waiving the appraisal contingency, but that one closes second, but you know it's going to be a great comp for the one that you sold first. Can you, when you dispute it, if it doesn't make value, can you use that comp if it's closed by then? I'm meaning the second house.
Good question. Yes.
And then, yeah, go ahead.
So the short answer is yes, you can, but there's always a but, right? So we are only allowed to use sales as of the effective date of the appraisal, right? So let's say that the appraisal on home 1 that sold for the lower amount was yesterday, and home 2 closed today, the higher one, right? We can use that sale, but the appraiser has to go back out to the subject, right, per the scope of work, update the effective date of the appraisal to today, which now makes that second sale good, right? So it can be used. There's just some hoops that we got to jump through in order to make that sale viable, because we cannot use a sale that closed after the effective date of an appraisal. Does that make sense?
What would be the likelihood of an appraiser actually, like, all of a sudden it comes in low, the agent says, hey, I know that there's one that's going to close before this one closes. Can you guys take a look? Can you wait to do the appraisal, or would you reappraise it, or could you do the second appraisal, or how would that work?
So there's a myriad of different ways. And again, Sharon, this all depends on who the AMC, the lender's working with, right?
AMC meaning, what is AMC?
I'm sorry, AMC is my company, the appraisal management company, right? So we manage what appraisers we have on the panel. We choose who it is, all that kind of stuff, right? We manage the compliance, all of the guidelines, the rules, and the laws. It's my job to manage the appraisers and the lender in between them and make sure everybody's following the rules, okay? So we've got a deal with Jackie's right now. Now it's a refi. It's not a purchase, but there are 2 sales we're waiting on to close. The value didn't come in where we need it. We are waiting on those deals to close. We will go back out, update the effective date of the report, use those 2 sales, and the value will probably jump a good 10 or 15 grand, right? So it all depends on, we are willing to do that, and my appraisers are willing to do that. It is within the scope of the rules and the laws. We are allowed to do it. So yes, we would do it. I can't speak to other companies. I don't, I just don't know how flexible they are on stuff like that.
Somebody in the chat said, could you speak about, do solar panels, generators, other technology thing, do you give any value if those are on a property?
So, they're becoming a little more common these days. I just got my astronomical generator quote a couple of days ago. Speaking of prices going up, good Lord. Supply and demand working there too, right after COVID. But solar panels and generators, until there is a trackable scenario where we can track that data on Matrix or MLS or what have you, and run data to show, right, that these 2 homes were similar. This one had solar panels and it sold for 2% more. Theoretically, because it had solar panels. Now we start to back into adjustments, right? So until that becomes commonplace enough where we can run data, there's no real way to extract a market-based adjustment for solar panels or generators. However, most appraisers these days will try to just give you a token adjustment, because we know they cost. We know they cost money. We know they inherently add value to the home. The problem we run into is we are required, if we were to get reviewed, we are required to show data to back up every adjustment that is made. They want us to show how we extracted that adjustment, right? Either through paired sales analysis or substitution method or whatever the case may be, whatever method we use, we have to show it. And until we get more data in regards to solar panels and generators, and they start tracking that stuff in MLS where we can run data to show it, right? It becomes just more of a token adjustment. And so on the solar panel thing, I mean, I know they cost way more than $5,000, but I wouldn't get, you know, you're probably going to see more, maybe $5,000 just as a token. We're trying to help out here. Same thing on the generator. I mean, my generator bid was $27,000, and I would hate to just get $5,000 on it, but that's just the reality right now.
I don't think a lot of people were here in 2008 in the big meltdown, and I think that the people feel like the whole crisis was contributed to a lot by fraudulent appraisals. So after that, the government came in and put a lot more guidelines on what you can and can't do than before. Is that correct? And so I think people say, well, why is that the rule? Why is that the rule? But I think that that not having the rules, the MAI used to stand for made as instructed, right? That's the designation of appraiser. Right. So anyway, I'm just hoping that people don't shoot the messenger that's spreading the message.
Look, unfortunately, I've kind of mastered the art of delivering bad news. I don't like it, but it is what it is. It's my job. So, but yeah, just real quick, guys, for those of you who weren't here in 08 and 09, right? The financial crisis or the mortgage meltdown, whatever they coined it to be, they really attributed that a lot to rapidly rising home prices and appraisers just going out and making values, but it also had a lot to do with the lending guidelines were way more lenient, right? So the box that we could fit the appraisal through was like this big. Now it's about that big, right? And so in typical government fashion, they knee-jerked and went from way loose to way tight, right? And now they're starting to loosen up a little bit, and then we're in this market, and this won't go on forever. Right, I can assure you. You know, my biggest concern with the market that we're in today, you know, not just in Houston, but in Austin right now, we're dealing with stuff in Austin that is mind-boggling. We're seeing stuff out on the outskirts of Austin, so not even in Austin, the city. Circle C Ranch. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but it's like a suburb. We see homes listed for $400, selling for $650. We had a home the other day listed for $625, sold for $880. Like what? You know, I don't. And what it is, it's out of state people coming in from the coast, and they don't care. They're paying the cash difference. And Austin is turning into a California real estate market like right now, right in our eyes. It's happening. You know, and everybody's like, oh, my values went up. You know, that's all great. But in our industry, for you guys and for me and for lending, you know, we can't do one deal and retire, right? I need turnover. I need volume. I need units, just like you guys do. We got to sell houses and move houses, right? And so I fear that with the home prices rising as rapidly as they are in every market, and thank goodness Houston has kind of been at bay better than Dallas and Austin, in Texas in particular, in San Antonio. But we're pricing out a lot of first-time home buyers, a lot of millennials that may not have the cash to come down. We have people in Austin now that work in Austin that are trying to buy in the middle of nowhere because they can't afford to be in Austin anymore. Just 6 months ago, they were on contract. It fell through. Now they can't afford to be there. Like, it's happening. And I see it every single day. And so that's my fear with this big housing boom and the pricing. And, you know, the COVID attributed to the lack of the shortage of materials, which made everything go up, right, on the building side as well. They can't keep up with the market. It's that we're pricing out a large portion of home buyers that used to be there. And now they're not. They're not going to be there because it's just too expensive. So
hey, can we take one more question?
That's the stuff that keeps me up at night, Sharon.
Hey, Shawn, I've heard you answer this before, but I want to hear now. COVID, the two biggest price adjustments that everybody goes back and forth, buyers, sellers, other agents. What value do you put on a pool and a new roof on a home?
So I'm going to answer the roof question first because it's very simple one, right? A roof is considered maintenance, right? You have to have a viable roof to have a livable home. Now, you will have some appraisers out there that'll give you 5 or 10 grand for a new roof. But again, it's kind of like solar panels. There's no trackable thing in MLS that says, hey, this house had a new roof and this one didn't. So we can track it to see how much, right? So you'll get a token adjustment. Some appraisers give no adjustment because it is you have to have a roof, right? So that's going to be a coin flip, depending on how aggressive the appraiser is and who it is. Pools. This is a little bit more of an in-depth answer. Pre-COVID, I would have told you that pools, which you can't just put a number on pools, right? A pool on $1 million house, theoretically, is going to be way more expensive and worth way more than a pool on a $400,000 house, right? Assuming that they didn't over improve the pool in the $400,000 house, right? Adjustments need to be commensurate with the pricing of the home. Otherwise, you're over improved. And so, but from a cost perspective, I would have told you 30 to 35% of cost. Post-COVID, because people are staying home, they're not going to the community pool. They want their backyard oasis from a safety perspective now, right? Even more so than it, it was becoming a big trend, but now it's even more so. We've seen pools take on 60 to 70% of cost over the past year or so. So that is by far, to me, other than just home prices going up, but just an amenity that has measurably gone through the roof, right? Because of COVID, in my opinion, is a pool and a backyard oasis. They really carry a lot more weight and get more contributory value now than they did a year ago. And that is simply because of COVID. Now, don't misconstrue what I'm saying here. You still don't go add a pool to your house to get value. You're going to be in a losing situation, right? You just won't lose as much as you did pre-COVID, I guess. So yeah, pools are carrying a lot more weight these days. So I would venture to say if you can come to a cost figure more like 60 to 70% versus 30 to 35% pre-COVID.
Thank you so much, Shawn. Let's everybody give him a big hand. It's so informative. And if you have any questions you didn't get to ask him, then we'll just shoot it to Jackie, and Jackie can maybe get some of the answers for you. Send it to Carissa or Jackie or Chris. So anyway, that's it for today. And thank you very much for coming. And we really appreciate it. Thank you, Shawn.
Thank you, guys. Look forward to the fishing.
Okay.